every foe is vanquished, and Christ is Lord indeed. Stand up for Jesus, the trumpet call obey. Forth to the mighty conflict in this His glorious day. Ye who are men now serve Him against unnumbered foes. Let courage rise with danger, and strength to strength oppose. Stand up for Jesus, the strife will not be long. This day the noise of battle, the next the victor's song. To Him who overcometh, a crown of life shall be. He with the King of glory shall reign eternally. All right, thank you. You may be seated. Haven't led a hymn in a while. So turning your Bibles tonight to Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. We began a couple weeks ago the book of Romans. We're going to walk through it together. I know last week we had Brian Cox came and preached for me, and I heard he did a tremendous job. And Brian's a great little preacher, and so I appreciate him so much coming to do that. But I heard a story one time I think goes really well with the gospel message tonight in Romans chapter 1. The Apostle Paul writes this in the latter part of his life. And as Martin Luther said, Romans is Paul's masterpiece, which I would agree. Romans is his masterpiece. Many have called it a treatise. It's a treatise, a declaration of a belief. And so Romans is very carefully done. It's very methodical. It's easily outlined. It's in sections. Very easy to look at how he transitions from one theme to another. But I heard a story once of a governor who, it was a hypothetical story. I don't think it was true. It's just a story someone told to implement a point. That a governor gave a man a pardon. There was a man sitting on death row, and he was scheduled to go to the death penalty. A governor gave a pardon to one of his aides. He said, "This is for this man. I need you to take it and deliver it." This is in the old days, of course. You couldn't fax it or email it. "I need you to take this pardon, deliver it to the prison, because this man is awaiting pardon. I have given him that pardon. I need you to deliver it." And the man took that pardon, put it in his coat pocket, and on the way home he stopped and got dinner, and then he went home that night, and then his friends called him, and he went and played golf the next day, and then he went out of town, and he just never got around to delivering it. He was supposed to deliver it, but it was in the late evening, and he didn't think it was that urgent. He didn't know the guy was scheduled to die that quick. He thought it was kind of a long-term thing. It was coming down the road. Finally, when he got to the jail to deliver it, it was too late. The man had been executed. I don't think that's true. It's just a story to implement a point and to make a point, and that's this. The world is on death row. They are on death row for their crime. What is that crime? That crime is sin against God. You and I have been given, they've been pardoned if they'll only get it, if they can get it, right? If they can just get that pardon, they will be set free. And for whatever reason, God has chosen to make us delivery mailmen for that pardon. Now, a pardon has to be accepted, and the individual who's the recipient of that pardon has to admit guilt. Did you know that? Did you know in a pardon, even in every legal state, you have to admit guilt? to get the pardon. You get set free, but you got to admit guilt. Especially, I know it is that way in the state of Georgia. I had a pastor tell me that one time. So it's very true. But we get to deliver the pardon. But many times we delay in delivering the pardon. And Paul writes this beautiful letter, the letter of Romans, to the church at Rome. And, you know, the New Testament is interesting, and we're in the Epistle section. We're in the letters section. The first epistle written is the book of Galatians. Paul wrote it first. They are not in order by which they were written. They are written, I don't know why they're in that order, but that's the order they're in. They're written in just a chronological order. I don't know why they did it that way. But Galatians was written first. Paul wrote Galatians before 50 A.D. So it's really close to Jesus. Jesus ascended, died on the cross and ascended in 33. So it was in like 48 to 50 A.D. when Paul wrote Galatians. It's real close. Then he wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So Galatians and Thessalonians are the first two epistles Paul wrote in his early ministry. Then he wrote Colossians, Philippians, Ephesians, and Philemon together on his second missionary journey. And then he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and he wrote Romans on his third missionary journey. So Paul went on 4. 3 are recorded in the book of Acts. He went on 4. His fourth one, he never left Rome. He ended up in Rome, in the maritime prison. Paul was in prison twice. He was in prison the first time, recorded in the book of Acts, in a house prison. It was actually not too bad. He was chained to the floor, but he was in a house. He was able to write. He had paper. He had pencils. He had things he could send out, parchments and things. But the second time, he was in the maritime prison in Rome, underground, in the cellar. It was a bad situation. That's where he died. But he went on 4 missionary journeys. And he wrote the books of Titus and 1 Timothy on his 4th missionary journey. And then he wrote 2 Timothy, his last imprisonment in Rome, literally before he died. So I'm just kind of giving you an idea of how it flows, you know. I said that to say this. Romans was not written when he was a new Christian. Okay? Even Galatians, he had been a Christian for roughly 20 years. Okay? So he was not a newbie by any stretch of the imagination on any of these epistles. But when he wrote Romans, Paul had been a preacher of the gospel for many years. I'm talking 40 years. Easy. And so, I mean, maybe 30-something, maybe something like that, 30-something years. Because he died in 64, I believe 64 A.D. is when he was beheaded in Rome, according to history. So, he had been around a long time. He had thought this through. He had fought the theological battles. He had studied thoroughly the Old Testament. Paul had an extraordinary mind. He was a brilliant person, and God used him for that. But he wrote this, and in verse 1 last week, or 2 or 3 weeks ago, when I preached the first part, I literally almost got through verse 1. I mean, I went a little farther, but I preached literally verse 1. And we learned that Paul, he said, I am a preacher of the gospel. I'm a gospel preacher. That's what Paul was. And those of you who were here that night, I don't want to say this to bore you, but those who weren't here, the name Saul was his given name, which means tall man, man of high stature. The name Paul means short man, small man. So Saul changed his name to Paul after he was converted. He wanted to make a point with his name that I am not a big man. I am not a man of greatness. I am a small man. We also know Paul's first conversion, the first convert that he made, was a man named Sergius Paulus. So many people believe he named himself after his first convert to remind himself of his mission. Sergius Paulus was a Gentile. And Paul said, I am called to the Gentiles. That was his ministry. And so a lot of times people wonder, why is he called Paul all of a sudden? You know, where'd that come from? We don't know, other than he named himself And he did it in a way to display his heart towards his mission and what he was called to do. And so he declares himself in verse 1 of Romans 1 as a gospel preacher, a man of the gospel. Then he goes on in verses 2 through 5 to talk about a promised gospel. The gospel is not something, the good news of Jesus was not something God just came up with on the fly. I mean, it was something that had been pending and playing out in the Old Testament through the prophets and through Moses and Abraham and David and all of it. It was making its way to Jesus when he would come. We learned Sunday about Moses and Elijah coming to see Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, and they talked to him about his death because this was something that had been in planning, something that they were anticipating, and now Jesus, when he came, he revealed more of it and excited them. The gospel will mean so much to us in heaven because it's the great news that got us to heaven and got us in God's presence and got us forgiven. But also, it will mean so much to the Old Testament saints as well because they longed for it and they looked for it. So we learned last time we were together about a gospel preacher and a gospel promise. But we learn also in verses 6 through 13, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, about a gospel people. The church at Rome, he talks about them. He says, I've heard about you. He says, I want to come see you. I want to come visit you. I want to meet you. He didn't want to pastor them. They had already been started. Paul did not start the church at Rome. Neither did Peter. Neither did Peter. You know, the Catholic Church believes Peter started the church at Rome. It's historically inaccurate. Peter had never even been to Rome. Paul went to Rome first. Paul wrote to the Romans while Peter was in Palestine. He was in Jerusalem. And he said, I heard about you. They were already around. The church at Rome was started after Pentecost. There were some Latin men who were there at Pentecost who got converted, went back to Rome, started the church. And they probably had friends who were in Jerusalem who were converted as well. Some came from Palestine, and they built this church, and it was a thriving church. And they were a gospel people. They were a people who were growing. That church had Gentiles and Jews in it. It had both. And so Paul writes to a gospel people. So you have a gospel preacher in verse 1. You have a gospel promised in verses 2 through 5. And you have a gospel people in verses 6 through 13. But in verses 14 and 15, where I'm going to zero in tonight, verse 14, 15, 16, 17, you have a gospel passion. You have a gospel passion. And then in verses 16 and 17, you have a gospel power. Okay? This is all introduction. This is the introduction to Romans that we're in tonight. Last time and this time. So let me begin reading. Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 14. And it says, I am a debtor, both to Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as is in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. Powerful verses. 4 verses, but man, are they loaded, aren't they? What do you see automatically? You see 3 I am statements. You can take your little pen or your little highlighter. There's 3 I ams there. Right? Let's go. The first one, he talks about his passion, the gospel passion. Verse 14, he says, I am a debtor. Now, many times people may misunderstand this. They think, well, we can't buy salvation, Pastor. Did Paul believe he had to work to earn something from God? No. His salvation is not to be bought. But what Paul feels is that he owes God his life because God bought his life. It's the least he can do. He said, I'm giving him my life. I'm giving God my life. I am a debtor. But notice, he feels in debt to people. It's not a debt that he expresses to God. It's a debt he expresses about people. You notice that? He says, I am a debtor to Greeks, to barbarians, to wise, unwise. Notice how the debt is not up, the debt is out. What does Paul mean? He says, I owe it to people to tell them to deliver the papers of pardon. Right? What he's saying is, I have received this gospel, and it's changed my life. And the least I can do is take it to the nations. Take it to the people. Take it to the world. I owe it to the Greeks. The Greeks were considered civilized people. They were the civilized. They conquered the world. The Greco-Roman culture. Look at the Greeks, for instance, what they contributed. I used to be a world civ teacher. I used to teach world civ. I taught history of all levels. I taught ancient civilization. I taught modern history, world history. I taught European history. I taught American history, modern and old. I taught it all, And what I would do when I got to ancient civilization is there were the four main empires. You had the Assyrians, you had the Babylonians. The Syrians didn't count, but you had the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. When I got to the Greeks, the kids always loved the Greek section. You know why? Because there were so many things they contributed to us. Gymnasiums, phys ed, physical education, the sciences and biology, and so many things in philosophy, and so many things in education. We have a Greco-Roman style of education here in the United States. It is very similar. You gather the students, you teach them, you let them experiment, you build their bodies, their minds, and everything. You want to make a full human to be physically fit, but also mentally fit. And so a lot of our education is based on this civil Greek education. It was something that they reveled in, and the philosophies involved. And so Greeks in the days of Paul were very educated people. They were very smart. They were very civilized. You could go to Athens. I know the Coans were in Greece last week. Those ruins of the Parthenon and all that, those have been around for thousands of years. They were mind-boggling to the people of their day. It was something to see what the Romans and the Greeks contributed to the world in architecture and in all of this stuff was remarkable. City structures and so forth. We now see the ruins of them, but in those days they were very modern and civilized and very cutting edge. And Paul says, I owe the gospel to those smart people. They're smart, but they're lost. So Paul said, I owe it to the Greeks to go and to tell them about Jesus. We can read in the book of Acts how he did that. He went to Mars Hill, and he said, I saw a lot of God temples, but there was one to the unknown God. I'm here to tell you about him. And he confronted Greek philosophers. He confronted people who were deists and Stoics and all these people who were very smart, and he was able to talk with them in a way they would understand. He went where they are because why? He owed it to them to tell them the truth. He owes it to them to tell them the truth. He said, I am a debtor to the Greeks, but I'm also a debtor to the barbarians. Who's this? This is the uncivilized people. These are the people who live out in the woods, out in the sticks. The barbarians were not civilized. They were brutal. They were brutes. They didn't have the manners. They didn't have all of that head knowledge. They had fighting knowledge. They knew how to fight for what they needed. The strong survive in those cultures. We have those today. Those haven't went away. We think, we went past that. There's no barbarians around. I could show you. I could take you some places. It's very barbaric. Where Jim Elliot and all these missionaries went in Ecuador, those people they were killing each other. It was a barbaric society, but those guys felt obligated to take the gospel there. Those people need to have a chance to hear about Christ, and so they died making it possible. They had the same inner fire that Paul has here. He says, I got a passion for this. To the wise and the unwise, to the people who have a lot of education, people who don't. You know, when you go out in the world, you're going to find there are some people who are very brainy, who are very academic, who are very sharp in here. You'll find some people, they haven't read a book in their life. They don't have any interest in doing that. They're not book smart. They're brilliant with their hands. They're brilliant with building. They're brilliant with mathematics and carpentry, things like that. They're brilliant with farming, agriculture, but they may not have the education that some people have. Paul says, I don't care. Paul's not interested in what makes you smart or stupid. A person who is smart in one area or smart in another area or good over here, a person who just walks the street, has no interest in learning anything, who all they care about is their next meal, they have no interest in advancing their life. What does Paul say? They need to hear about Jesus. I am a debtor to them. In other words, I don't pick and choose. Everybody. Whoever I come in contact with. You know, I think Paul was thinking here. Now, I can't read a man's mind. I think Paul was thinking about when Stephen was stoned. Because it says in Acts that when Stephen was killed, Paul held the coats for the men who threw the rocks to kill that guy. He was not a believer, but he saw Stephen die in the streets of Jerusalem for declaring the gospel, and he held the jackets so the men could throw the rocks. And I think Paul thought about that all his life. Man, I stood there and watched that man die for Jesus, and now the message he preached was a life-giving, powerful, passionate message, and I stood there and held their jackets while they killed him, and he says, I owe it to Stephen to preach what I know now. I owe it to Stephen to carry on what he was trying to do. You think he was thinking about that? Do you think he thought about, the old saints, the prophets who were stoned for following God? Paul says, I'm a debtor to the world. And so are we. I owe it to the people who shared Jesus with me to share it to somebody else. How many of you would have got saved if somebody hadn't told you? Nobody just comes up with this. We don't say, you know what? We're blessed because we have the gospel all around us, because we live in a Bible Belt. We live in a very biblical-based society. Not in practice, but in knowledge. We have it at our disposal. Think about who led you to Jesus. And think about who led them to Jesus. Think about who put the money to build this building that we could stand in here tonight and sit in here and listen to the Bible preached. Think about all the investment of past generations. I owe it to them to preach the gospel truthfully in this pulpit here. Don't we? I owe it to them to give it all I've got every time. But not just to them, I owe it to God alone. I owe it to all of them. I'm not bragging, but I am in a fraternity line, a lineage of preachers that goes all the way back to Jesus. It's a privilege to me. One I don't take lightly. I am not giving you a Saturday night special where I sit down on Saturday night and go, well, what am I going to do tomorrow? If I do that, slap me. There's no way. I mean, Ellis Lark and I were talking one day. He said, preacher, you always bring it. I said, let me tell you something. I will never get in a pulpit and not be ready. It's best I can be. I'm going to be ready. Because you know what? This is too important to get up here half-cocked. Because you don't know who's coming in here on Sunday. Some family member has tried to get those people in that pew for 6 months, and they come in and sit down for the first time, and the preacher gets up and goes, well, I didn't prepare well, y'all. This was what I came up with last night. Oh, my word. Shame on them if someone does that. We owe it to the people who are behind us, and we owe it to Jesus who died for us. We owe it to them to give the gospel, and we owe it to them to do it responsibly and to do it the best we can. This morning, I was living this. I thought about this as I actually wrote this today. I've been studying all week, but I finally wrote the final outline this morning. I was coming to work this morning, right down the road from me. Now, I'm not going to use any names, but there's a neighbor that lives about a mile from me. His grandmother and grandfather stopped in my mom's yard when she was a little girl and took her to church. They were playing in the yard, her and my aunt. And they saw on Sunday morning as they were driving to Friendship Baptist Church down Hamby Road, they saw these two little red-headed girls playing in the yard every Sunday morning. And they pulled in there one day and said, "Do you want to go to church? We will take you." And they went in and asked my grandmother, who was not going at the time. She said, "Take them, sure." And they took my mom to church, and my mom got saved there. Well, down the road from me, the grandson of those two people is my neighbor, and he's not churched. So this morning, as I walk my road, every time I see that house, God says, "You need to stop and see him. You need to stop and see him." And so today, I was driving to work, and there he was. He was in the yard, right? So I whipped in there, met him for the first time. Lived there a year and a half. I haven't met him yet. And this is what I told him. I'm going to tell you what I told him. I said, "Your grandparents stopped in my grandmother's yard and took my mama to church." And I said, "I'm so grateful because my mom found Jesus in that church. I owe it to God and your grandparents to come by and invite you to church." And he just looked at me. He said, "Is that right?" I said, "It's true." He may come, he may not. He's not here tonight. I looked around before I started because I knew I was going to use this. And I don't think he has any internet of any kind. But I said, "I owe it to you." And then I shared Jesus with him. I owed it to his grandparents to do the same to their grandson as they did to my mother. Do you understand? We owe it to the Jew, to the Greek, to the barbarian, to everyone. We are debtors. Paul says, "I'm a debtor," and he was passionate about it. I owe it to William Tyndale to read my Bible because he gave his life to put it in English for me. When I hear people, now I'm not trying to knock you if you don't read well, but when people say, "I can read, but I don't read the Bible because I don't understand it." I mean, if you knew the bloodshed that took place to put a Bible in your hands and my hands, could you look those people in the eye and say, "Well, I know you got strangled to death and burned at the stake for putting it in my language for me. Thank you very much, but I never read it." I mean, people like William Tyndale who gave his life to put it in English for me. And his last words before they strangled him on that post in England was, "Oh God, open the king's eyes." What's he mean by that? That he will publish that book that he translated into English. And you know what? There was a king named James who came around after he died about 20 years and said, "You know what? This is good stuff. Let's put it in English. Let's publish it." The King James Bible came from William Tyndale's labor. I owe it to William Tyndale to read my Bible. But more importantly, I owe it to Jesus because he made it possible, right? And so I owe it to Paul, who wrote this book, to dive into it and make it a part of my life. So he says, "I am a debtor." Secondly, he says, "I am ready." I am ready. Ready to what? He says, "I am ready to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome." He says, "I got a plan. I'm coming and I'm going to preach to you. I can't wait to get there." You know? And he says, "I am ready." We must be ready to share Jesus. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, "I'm not ready. I don't know how to do that." What I tell people is this: don't overcomplicate it. You don't have to be the smartest person in the world theologically. You don't have to have a PhD to witness to people. Just tell them what Jesus did to you. Tell them how you got saved. In the end, that's the greatest power you have. You know, as I witness to Muslims, I'll talk theology with them a while, but I never finish a conversation without telling them, can I tell you how I became a Christian? And I tell them. I've told microbiologists who are evolutionists. I witnessed to a guy who was a microbiologist professor at Howard University. We went back and forth about evolution creation for about 10 minutes, and finally I said, well, you know, I know I'm not going to convince you in this regard, but can I at least tell you how I became a Christian? And I told him, and you know what he said? He said, I wish I had a story like that. They don't have that. You know, but in the end, our story, your story and mine, how we came to faith, we tell them. And we need to always be ready to tell them. We need to always be ready and looking for places we can share our story about Jesus. You know, I preached this one time. Wasn't the last time I preached it. When I preached, there was one night when I was a young preacher, I preached this, be ready. I was a guest at a church, and they asked me on a Sunday night to come and preach, and I went and I preached, always be ready to share the gospel. And I left, and it was on a Sunday evening, it was dark, and I went over a place called the Conowingo Dam. It's one of the biggest eagle reservoirs on the East Coast. Eagles everywhere, bald eagles. And I come across, and I turn right on a road called the Flats. Scary road, creepy road. They found dead bodies on it. People used to dump bodies in the swamp there. It was a very creepy road. No spotlights, no street lights. It was a dark, straight road. I don't want to say I used to drag race, but I used to race. I'd take my Camaro, me and my buddies, and we would go side by side and see who could win. Very dangerous, and I was stupid. But I used to race on that road. But that road always was strange. But one day I took that road, after I preached that message, pulled down that road, and I'm going down there in the pitch black dark. All of a sudden, in the distance, I see a pillar of flame, smoke. And I see a man in the street, and he's got his phone out. And I pull up, and I said, what's going on? He said, there was a head-on collision right here. And so I got out, and I walked up, and there was a car sideways in the middle of the road, pitch black. I couldn't hardly see, smoke coming up everywhere. And I walked up, and I looked, and the guy behind me pulled a mag light out and shined inside. And the man was drunk. He had been drinking. He was really bad drunk, and his face was hanging off, but he was alive. And he screamed at me. It was the scariest scene I've ever seen. He started cussing me when that light hit his face, and I jumped back. It scared me to death. But I tried to get him out. I was trying to pull the door open, trying to get him out. He's cussing, swearing, losing his mind, you know. And then I looked over, and I saw a car like an accordion. I mean, it was just smashed, flipped upside down in a ditch, in like a thicket swamp, like swamp underneath. And I went over there, and I said, ooh, that's bad. And the guy went over, and he said, that guy, I could hear a man under there. Couldn't get him out. It was just too smashed underneath. We couldn't pull. Ambulances were coming. I said, you know what, I'm going to get out of the way, because these guys are going to want to get these people out of these cars. And so I went to get in my car, and boy, God got a hold of me. You ever had that happen? He said, you know what you just preached? Always be ready. You don't know if that young man over there, it's his last minute. And you know what I did? I was in a suit. Rare. So I went over and I went where that smashed car was. The guy over here, he wasn't interested. I could see that right away. I squatted down underneath in that ditch and I called out. And I said, can you hear me? And he, I could hear him. He was making this noise. I said, you hear me? Respond. He was making a noise. I said, okay. I said, listen to me. This may be your last moments. I don't know. You need to be saved. I said, pray this prayer with me. And I prayed the sinner's prayer. And when I got done, I said, did you pray that prayer? And I backed up, and the ambulances came in, and they began to get around. I got out of the way, and I left. I couldn't see him. The next morning, I opened up the newspaper, and his picture was there. 18-year-old boy. His name was Ricky. He got killed. He died. I saw his picture, and I said, that's who was under that car. And I told some friends at band practice. I told them what happened. It really shook me up, you know. Well, one of those people knew that boy's father. I didn't know this. Well, his wife did. Well, she went and told him. She said, I got great news. My pastor was with your son and prayed the sinner's prayer with him. You'd think that'd be good news, unless you're an atheist. His father was an atheist. He said, give me his number. I'd like to talk to him. So she called me and said, I got his number. And I'm thinking, okay, it's going to be, I'm glad to give the good news that I did. You know, so I was kind of aggravated she told him. But anyway, because I didn't know, this is raw, you know. And I called him. He said, yeah, this is him. Who are you? I said, I told him who I was. He said, well, what happened? And I told him what I just told you. He said, you're a liar. My son was dead instantly. He didn't live. You're a liar. And I said, sir, I'm so sorry for your loss, and I didn't mean to inflict more pain on you. I'm just telling you what happened. And I will not bother you any longer. And so we parted ways and hung up. 1 year later, I was at church. The phone rang. My secretary picked up, and they said, is there a preacher there about 30 years old named Phillips? Apparently, they had done the math. And she said, oh, yeah, he's right down here. The young one. We got the young one. We have an old one and a young one. They said, no, this is a young guy. So they put me through. And she said, are you a Phillips pastor? I said, I am. She said, I've been hunting you. We've been hunting you. We've been looking for you. I said, what do you mean? She said, I've looked at every church in Port Deposit where you live, looking for a pastor named Phillips. We were at the autopsy result. We had a meeting with the coroner. So we're going through a lawsuit with this guy who hit my brother. And the coroner told us that our brother was alive for 30 minutes under that car. And my stepfather, or my father who was standing there, it was a divorce situation, he said, that preacher was right. And they go, what preacher? I said, that preacher, I had a preacher call me, said he prayed with Ricky before he died. They were all mad. You didn't tell us that, Dad. Well, I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings. I didn't want to call. But that preacher said he was alive, and he prayed with him. Who is he? Well, we don't know. And so they came and found me. And they said, we'd like you to come to dinner. We want to meet you. We want to know what happened. And so I met him at a restaurant. The whole family came. Brothers. He had a bunch of siblings. He had a mother, a stepfather. And the real father wouldn't come. He wouldn't be there. And I sat at that table, and I told them what happened. And that mother just bawled. And she said, Ricky had a dream a week before he died that he was going to die. And it scared him to death. So he went to a local preacher, and that preacher led him to Christ the week before he died. And she said, he got killed in that wreck, and I was so worried he was alone. And she said, but God sent you. God sent you to be in that spot, to help my son go through that wreck. And she said, I haven't slept a wink, but I'll sleep tonight. And you know what happened after that? About a year later, they called me and they said, we do a big old motorcycle Harley-Davidson ride for Ricky. We call it the Ricky Ride, and it's to raise money for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Would you please come and pray over that event? And I said, well, I am as far from a biker as you're going to find. I wear polo shirts. You know, and they said, you were the last one with our Ricky. If anybody gives you a problem, you tell us. And I showed up, and I pulled up in there. There were hundreds of bikers. They were everywhere. I mean, they were all over. And the dad got up, and he said, listen up. This is the last person with our Ricky. This is Preacher Josh. Whatever he says, y'all listen. So I stood up on that thing and I preached Jesus to those people. And I said, let me tell you something. What the devil meant for bad, God meant for good. And I said, God will save all of you if ever you just ask him. And I gave the gospel. Nobody got saved that day. But you know who was there? That atheist father. And he walked up to me when I was done. He hugged me around the neck. He said, I'm so sorry. He said, I'm so sorry. I was so angry. I said, it's all right. He said, I heard what you said. He didn't get saved, but he said, I heard what you said. It meant a lot to me. You said, Pastor, why'd you tell me that story? Because we always have to be ready to share the gospel. We've always got to be ready. And I preached it in a pulpit, but God got a hold of me and said, are you going to live that, or are you just going to say it, right? But God took that moment and made it something bigger. And I ended up going to that thing every year till the time I moved. And even today, I texted them and told them, I've moved away. They said, oh, we miss you. And you know, that boy's sister got married about 5 years later, and they called me up and said, will you and your wife come to the wedding? We want you to stand in for Ricky. And I did. And I was able to pray over that wedding. And God used it to be a lifeline to many of those folks. We've always got to be ready. Paul said, he said, I'm a debtor, and I got to be ready. But thirdly, I know I'm over, but hang tight. We have gospel power here. He says we got gospel passion, we got gospel power. Verse 16, he says, and I am not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. For it is the power of God. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Paul says the gospel may sound like a stupid story. He said, I'm here in these Greek towns, and I'm telling them that all the hope of the world is in a carpenter from Nazareth who died as a criminal on an old rugged cross and who rose from the grave. To a Greek Stoic in Athens, that is the dumbest thing anyone could ever hear. Paul even said later, to the Greeks, it's foolishness. And to the Jews, a stumbling block. He said, but I'm telling you, it's the power of the gospel. It's the power that changes people. That word power there is the word we get the word dynamite from. It's dynamo, dunamos. Dunamos. It can tear you up and build you back. That's what I love about the gospel. The gospel will blow you up and put you back together. The gospel will destroy your plans and give you better ones. And he says, and watch it carefully, he says, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. You see that? Who believes. Believe. It's that simple. It's that simple. When a child comes to me, I had one the other day come, they're not quite ready yet, they're getting close. And I said, she's close, but I want her to know who to believe in and why she needs him. That's all I need to know. When she gets to that point, she's ready. Right now, she's not accountable because she don't understand that yet. But I want her to get there. When she gets there, we'll know that she's ready. But it's belief. It's belief. Christmas Evans, an old preacher, said this, the gospel is so simple. You could put a man in a barrel, put a cap on top of it, poke a hole in the top, let the light shine through, and you could whisper it in there and he'd understand it. That's so true. We really overcomplicate it. He says it's a power of God to those who believe, to the Jew first and to the Greek. He said it came to Israel first, now it's going to the world. And that's true. It's still going to the world to this day. And I love this part, and I'm going to hurry up here. He says the righteousness in verse 17 is revealed from faith to faith, from person to person. Why God did that, I'll never know. If people say, could you ask Jesus any questions? What would you ask him? Number one, why did you care about me? That'll be the first one. The first, why me? Why did you care? That'll be my first question. Second question, why in the world did you use people? Because we're really bad at it. I mean, think about it. Think about how we mess things up. We do it so bad. We're so bad. You know, the greatest challenge we have is ourselves. I often wonder, Lord, why in the world didn't you send angels? Why didn't you come and just come every year on Christmas again and just preach? You know, we'll put you on Fox News. You know, I don't understand why he decided to give it to 12 disciples who were men who were flawed and then have us do it. Why in the world did he pick us? I have no idea. But that's how Paul says it's revealed. It's revealed from person to person. Someone told you, who they were told, who were told, who was told, who was told. All the way back. It's told. It's proclaimed. From faith to faith. And then he says this, the just shall live by faith. You know that's mentioned 4 times in the Bible? Habakkuk, Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. You know, I always say if it's mentioned twice, you better listen. It's mentioned 4 times. Faith, the just, the ones who are just, they're just by faith. They live by faith. They live by belief. And you know that's what separates us from every other religion in the world. Everybody else lives by works. We live by belief. The gospel is powerful. Are you a debtor to the world? Yes. For the gospel? Yeah, we are. Are you ready to share the gospel? Are you ashamed of the gospel? You say, I just don't want to. I don't want to tell I don't witness to people because I'm afraid what they'll say. I'm afraid what will happen. I'm afraid. Here's the problem. I'm not being hard on you. Because you care about what people think more than what God thinks. I was there. I wouldn't witness to anybody. I was scared. I was scared I'd tick somebody off. They'd get mad at me. They'd argue with me. I would offend them. They would hurt my feelings. You know why? Because I love me. Their opinion of me mattered more than God's opinion of me. But here's what happens. The closer you get to Jesus, the more His opinion matters, and everybody else's doesn't. And you can tell people about Jesus, and they can shut you down, call you an idiot, and walk away from you, and you don't care. You're like, okay. I mean, bless your heart. Well, I'll pray for you. I mean, I don't know what to say. I gave it to you. Lord, are you happy? I'm happy. Good, I'm glad. That's all that matters to me. When Jesus is happy, you are happy. And the closer we get to the Lord, the less we care about what people think. The less ashamed we are. We shouldn't be ashamed. And lastly, are you saved? Is it by faith that you are saved? Is that what really happened in your life? Father God, tonight I pray that this passage will penetrate the hearts of all of us. Lord, if we could be like Paul. Oh man, someone who was completely sold out, passionate, and believed in this powerful gospel. He had a passion for the gospel because it was a power within it. And I'm so grateful for him and what he wrote to us. And I pray that, Lord, we will always realize that we need to tell the world. We are in debt to let them know. But, Lord, I pray that we will always be ready. And I pray we'll never be ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In Jesus'